Chapter 13: Security and the Humanization of Bureaucracy. Much of this book has tried to articulate the situation of, and predicaments intrinsic to, the enterprise of providing physical security. The drama of terrorism and counterterrorism captivates the imagination, is literally the stuff of movies and games, but as we have seen, the security enterprise is also, and just as essentially, bureaucratic and can be quite boring. Indeed, as both Catch-22 and Eichmann in Jerusalem make clear, the juxtaposition of killing with paperwork is itself dramatic, expressed also by military maps, in which small squares represent large units of fighting men, and how many casualties, how many orphans. Mostly, however, the work of security is intensely ordinary, the daily activity of professionals who work tirelessly so that nothing happens. Boredom is the point, as discussed in Chapter 5. Unlike Sisyphus's rock, which is pushed up and rolled back down, ideally the attack never comes, and the ceaseless training is done for a reason that never materializes. Meanwhile, however, the security apparatus engages the public it is designed to serve, and it does so by rule, both regulation and physical imposition. Restricted areas, protocols, iris scanning, mostly electronic stripping, the presumption of physical control over the traveler's body and belongings. While drama is implied, security is generally experienced as the more or less irksome execution of policies established elsewhere, maybe just an expensive waste of time. The common image of the bureaucrat, and by extension the business of not only the state, but also white-collar symbol manipulation, and by further extension the contemporary condition, is not pretty and not altogether wrong. Consider Bartleby the Scrivener, Scrooge, the inchoate dread of Kafka's characters, or Weber's rationalism and its attendant disenchantment. In contemporary public culture, consider Dilbert or The Office. Over a generation ago, the North Atlantic turned to the right, highlighted by the ascendancy of Reagan in the United States and Thatcher in the United Kingdom, was fueled, at least rhetorically, by opposition to bureaucracy, fussiness of the contemporary condition. Whatever it may have done for specific economic interests or society writ large, deregulation certainly and satisfyingly removed regulators. More recently, the various political movements grouped together under the heading populism have gathered adherents in international solidarity from their shared antagonism to the Mandarin elites with which large polities rule. Despite this frustration, bureaucracy shows no signs of going away. Shifts in political economy, for examples, the recent urbanization of billions, or the rise of the internet, or pointedly, if trivially, the emergence of offices with ping pong tables and beer in the afternoon, may change the aesthetics of the office a bit. We now have casual Fridays and more diverse workplaces where excellence is pursued as relentlessly as innovation. None of that means that bureaucracy as a mode of social, economic, and political life is fading at all. If anything, the world is becoming more and more bureaucratic as digitization allows near-universal record-keeping. Consider, for more examples, the rise of the administrative university or the contemporary hospital, where functions like teaching and medical care have become routinized and placed under the jurisdiction of webs of officials speaking HR. All symbol manipulation by elites, all the time. And what alternatives do we have other than chaos? Which is why, perhaps, so many people believe that anarchy will come, brought about by global warming, or some virus, or a rogue state, or the big electromagnetic pulse, or... By this same token, and as noted in the introduction, security is ubiquitous. Security names a bureaucratic preoccupation for the dangers the future may hold for the enterprise of running an airport, of maintaining a healthcare system, or a food supply, or an election. As more and more of life is placed under bureaucratic rule, the number of ways such rule may be insulted, disrupted, multiplied pace. The empire is stretched. There are many reasons for worry. Security is the armature for such worry, the bureaucrat's somewhat self-serving emphasis on the public protected. It is always for your security that you must do this or that. That is, a bureaucracy's recognition of a security concern simultaneously challenges and reiterates the bureaucracy's own jurisdiction. But there are reasons for worry, in fact. We do have problems, and therefore many ways in which we must work together, lest there be chaos. The question at this juncture is how such worries can be conducted to lead to productive participation, perhaps even cooperation. Maybe To use old words out of their traditional contexts, we can view security and even bureaucracy writ large with sympathy, if not quite solidarity or community. A more familiar and also convenient way to tell this story, at least the physical security part, is that our current preoccupation with security results from the form of contemporary violence, namely terrorism. To invert Shakespeare, the fault lies not in ourselves, but in our stars. So a long list of famous social scientists and philosophers have proclaimed ours to be an age of security. This new age, apparently, begins during the immediate post-Cold War period, a period marked by wishful thoughts. Perhaps the peace dividend would be paid out, history would end, and liberal democracy would reign free. To many, however, the New World Order of the late 1990s looks suspiciously like advancing Western hegemony, albeit without the political friction of socialist totalitarianism or the critical friction of a credible Marxism. Cassandra-like books and essays were published by the likes of William Connolly and Samuel Huntington, but these voices were drowned out by the high priests of liberal globalization on the one side and the neo-Marxists on the other side, who saw nothing to celebrate about Pax Americana. Then 9/11 happened and things became something else. Our time became the age of security, or so the story goes. What are we to do with this new security state? This is in fact an old problem in political philosophy, returned in new clothing. A few signposts may be useful here. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche sees nothing sacred in the worship of the new artificial master. He has this to say: "Somewhere there are still peoples and herds, but not with us, my brothers. Here there are states. State is the name of the coldest of all cold monsters. Coldly lies it also, and this lie creeps from its mouth. I, the state, am the people. Where there is still a people, there the state is not understood, but hated as the evil eye, and as sin against laws and customs. The state, I call it, where all are poison drinkers, the good and the bad. The state, where all lose themselves, the good and the bad. The state, where the slow suicide of all is called life." The phrase cold monster is striking, and thereby also distracting. Important for our purposes is this notion that outside, or perhaps somewhere below, is where one finds the people and thus freedom, whereas the closer one gets to power, the more artificial things become, and the more one finds little more than clamoring apes, to use Nietzsche's term, who worship power. During his lectures to the Collège de France during the late 1970s, Michel Foucault starts out by discussing technical matters of security and how they are directed towards the population, before pivoting to an attack on those who ascribe too much power to the state. Indeed, he insists that his objective is to put a stop to repeated invocations of the master, as well as to the monotonous assertion of power. Neither power nor master, neither power nor the master, and neither one nor the other as God. Indeed, Foucault wonders, if the state is not that kind of cold monster in history that has continually grown and developed as a sort of threatening organism above civil society, but rather is a way of governing, a type of governmentality. This is not to reduce everything to techniques and technologies, however, because the modern bureaucratic order, like any order, requires transcendental ideas. Foucault is well aware of Kant's insistence on focus imaginarius in the Critique of Pure Reason. The illusion that the lines have their source in a real object lying outside the field of empirically possible knowledge, just as objects reflected in a mirror are seen as behind it. Nevertheless, this illusion, which need not, however, be allowed to deceive us, is indispensably necessary if we are to direct the understanding beyond every given experience as part of the sum of possible experience, and thereby to secure its greatest possible extension, just as, in the case of mirror vision, the illusion involved is indispensably necessary. Even clamoring apes need something to hold on to, apparently. Meaning matters. In short, in these late imperial times, we must humanize officials and, conversely, understand ourselves as part of the order that we take seriously. Surely the critical social sciences must have something to say about bureaucracy, and surely those insights require some sort of verstehen, understanding entailing projection, and in that sense sympathy, if not agreement. And if that is the case, then absolutist dismissal of bureaucracy is off the table. But absolutist dismissal has moral clarity on its side. Nuance can look like a moral failing. splitting the difference between sympathy for the devil on the one hand and radical rejection of contemporary society on which they depend, reasonable souls may look within the key structures of modernity. So, it is said, modernity would not be so unbearable but for the fact that neoliberal technocratic types infuse our institutions like aliens or even zombies among us, and we good folk need to push back against them. But how? The most critical among us swear that they can show us a hidden terrain of governance composed of ethical and effective claims and conflicts, a sort of Samizdat network or even Illuminati for these dark times. We are skeptical about such descriptions of our situation. Consider M. He is the head of security for the airport in a key global city that, not incidentally, has suffered a terrorist attack. He is also his government's liaison to an international professional association with substantial de facto regulatory power over airports like his. M is a bureaucrat. He is not what operators sometimes call a capable individual, meaning capable of hurting people quickly. Nor does he enact violence. The history of airports is not especially rooted in militarism, colonialism, or sexism, though all played roles in creating the present. M is, rather, the kind of guy who will implement an efficiency model or optimize patrols so as not to interfere with the passenger experience. He knows that passengers are customers, consumers, and he has to keep them safe. His job is one characterized by responsibility more so than power. Indeed, he seems to himself as a person with surprisingly little room to maneuver. Where is M's hidden terrain of ethical effective claims and conflicts? The abstract ethnographic incantation of ethical and effective claims and conflicts take the concrete form of a story about a senior bureaucrat disagreeing with a new governance measure? How often? Much the same story emerges when we move from the tail toward the tip of the spear to speak with capable individuals, which are thick on the ground in places like Nairobi. We have found soldiers of various sorts and at various stages in their careers to be very interested in talking. The circumstances must be right. Introductions are often required. A bit of background is useful. But most importantly, people must sense that they are being taken seriously. And right, wrong, or indifferent, violence is serious. The current American adulation of its armed services is offensive, in large part because it is so unserious, forgivable only because we have so few alternatives. Less dramatically than the shadow wars, there is seriousness too in protecting an airport or commanding a reserve unit. And here we come closer to the everyday character of the modern, the institutional routinization of the well-lit portions of the globe. Perhaps the public good is in keeping things going, in the absence of a compelling reason to do just that. It is hard to keep things going. The virtuous terrorist attacks a castle with a God-shaped hole. Inside, some people provide security because that is what they do. Suppose, rather than preach truth to power, we speak with those who hold power, maybe even ask how their days are going. As this book has detailed, if we actually talk to bureaucrats and security operatives, a very different picture emerges. What follows is a reprisal of some key ways in which official power, power over modern life, is both quantitatively less and qualitatively different from what often is assumed. Knowledgeable uncertainty. As discussed in the opening of this book, in contemporary data-rich domains, information, sometimes boggling amounts of information, often coexists with significant uncertainty. While uncertainty may be part of the human condition, consciousness of uncertainty is hardly constant. Let us return to our mythological history of the latest fin de siècle. In hindsight, the end of the 20th century was marked by an astonishing level of confidence. Experts knew what they knew. Catchphrases, the end of history, the Washington Consensus, and the Great Moderation, express the spirit of the age that has passed. The attacks of September 11th and any number of computer hacks made us aware of insecurity in new ways. The U.S. Department of Defense began funding efforts to develop a science of security, largely connected with cybersecurity. The emergence of unlooked-for political developments like the Arab Spring and the insolvency of Greece and Brexit, to say nothing of the election of Donald Trump to the presidency of the United States, made experts look foolish in real time. And most importantly, the global financial crisis cast entire disciplines and core systems into doubt. Almost a full generation after September 11th, experts speak more hesitantly. One would have expected COVID-19 to see the return of the expert on horseback, but even the humble face masks proved too much to know, and conflicting advice flowed. Experts certainly know that their conceptual frameworks are compromised, but they are not sure how or to what extent. New paradigms are in short supply. And yet, we have more information than ever before, more capacity to surveil, collect, and process data, capacities which themselves raise problems. In such contexts, a host of conceptual and expressive tools are deployed to make sense of the world and act upon it, narratives and models, scenarios and exercises. Much of our research concerns the range of tools available and what such tools teach their users. Too often, social scientists have assumed that the tools of governance are either faulty or followed slavishly. Social scientists have tended to ask after the validity of the outputs, with an eye to challenging the legitimacy of the exercise of power. Bureaucracy is, of course, based on expertise, and expertise in turn rests on claims to the truth, so this line of attack makes some sense. But while validity is obviously important, bureaucratic expertise is a practice before and after. It is a substantive proposition, to be falsified or not. So, in an age of uncertainty, another truth has emerged. The map may be necessary, even if it is to some substantial but unknown degree wrong. The bureaucrat must continue to navigate, that is, to exercise power, even if expertise is dubious. Failures of security, being caught by surprise, do not lead to admissions of error, much less the abandonment of jurisdiction, but lead instead to more security, starting with measures designed to prevent the last failure, closing the barn door after the horse escapes. Regardless of the tools used, bureaucratic thinking in this hesitant age is often conducted with a view to conceptual horizons that seem difficult, if not impossible, to define. Security emerges in field after field, not as quite the same word, but with the same problems. Insecurity is obvious in the event. Whether or not something is secure, really secure, cannot be known. Is the airport secure? What did the last attack teach or fail to? Did the systems and structures built in response address the vulnerability? Cannot we imagine other vulnerabilities waiting supine to be exploited once discovered? Haunted by such questions, experts across a range of domains know that they do not know as much as they used to think they did, but must proceed nonetheless. Domain, limited agency, resource allocation. As discussed in Chapter 8, how do the relatively senior figures in which we are primarily interested locate their authority and specify their jurisdictions within a common contemporary, albeit one that is fractured or separated into silos? How do they organize their activity vis-a-vis other institutions? What relations do they have to manage? Who are the clients, consumers, or competitors? To whom do they ultimately answer? The scope of official agency is often quite narrow in practice, much narrower than implied by words like state, government, or even law. Such words are abstract, unspecified, and hence unconstrained, implying freedom of action. Actual officials, however, are specified in countless ways, hemmed in, their options limited. Actual officials never see the agency, and in that sense freedom, promised by the abstract state. Officials often have little capacity to do much besides what they already do, which may or may not be the right thing. Soldiers are similarly situated. In order to keep doing what they're doing at all, officials generally must struggle for resources. Many of the activities in which we are interested do not, in themselves, make money or otherwise generate resources. The compliance program is a cost center. Airport security is expensive, bothersome, and by its nature raises concerns about privacy, discrimination, and an overweening state. Much like a well-drafted legal document or a weapons system, not until things go badly wrong does a well-designed airport security system prove that the cost was worth it. Until such failures, the erosion of the institution's justification, and hence its funding, is the order of the day. This process of erosion is not unique to airport security. During a bull market, an understaffed U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, could and did ignore whistleblowers, and Bernie Madoff would operate a complex Ponzi scheme for years and years. The public. The public is neither neutral nor trivial nor often clearly specified. How do officials imagine their public or audience in terms of representation, the justification given to license actions or resource allocations, or to legitimate actions that may result in risk or failure. For whom are the experts expert? What counts as success or failure? And how does the success of the enterprise affect the future of an office or the trajectory of a career? How is the official rewarded or punished? And how are such actions publicly legitimated? Such questions are familiar, even traditional, in various governance contexts. The same questions take on added urgency in security contexts, when lives are often at stake and the usual mechanisms of transparency and accountability may not be available. The weight of history. In their scholarly, as opposed to institutional, mode, academics tend to understand present situations to pose questions. Critical social scientists in particular may think their mission is to articulate incisive questions. The luxurious presumption of such thinking is vast and rarely acknowledged. In the ivory tower, again as distinct from the career's concerns of actual academic life, the time is always now, the time in which questions are posed. History is to be questioned, which is another way of saying that history is not particularly imperative. Similarly, the future is a trope, not thought to require too much of us today. That is what it means to live safe within the tower, to be able to indulge such thoughts. A core faith of so-called engaged scholarship and enlightened politics more generally is that such thinking ultimately will resolve itself and give rise to action. Politics will be, in short and literally, rational. We will know what security is and take rational steps to achieve it. Indeed, that is the point of the secret college, understood to be a college, not least a group of thoughtful people. But as any honest professor knows, thinking often does not resolve itself. Thinking may be successful, but usually is not. One reaches an impasse, or more commonly still, matters become ambivalent, uncertain, and many things might be said, inconsistently, but with some truth. Thinking harder may not bring one closer to decision. Expertise often fails. Here I stand, says Weber, echoing Luther. Thought, and therefore putatively enlightened politics, is not rational, but existential. Political actors, in comparison with academics, do not enjoy the long now of thought. They are much more burdened by both the weight of the past and the imminence of the future. They have little time and must act anyway. Therefore, habit is substituted for imagination, office for merit, tactics for strategy, and custom for morality. The bureaucratic future tends to be like the recent past, only more so and improved. In contemporary settings like security, not only is the future not new, it is on the contrary quite often old, and consequently constrained. For dramatic example, the U.S. war in Afghanistan is now the nation's longest-running campaign. The forever war has become not something transitory to be won and so ended, but the norm, the context of business. How is the future of the war envisioned? What is the nation trying to accomplish? What is our preferred scenario? During the heyday of the neocons, there was talk of nation building, optimistic at the time and simply no longer credible. Getting bin Laden proved a purpose, if a grisly one, but he was finally killed. Political speeches continue to rely on abstractions, security, protecting freedom, etc., but they do not suffice to explain this policy, not that. Get the job done. But what is the job? President Trump ran on getting out of Afghanistan. He later supported sending another 4,000 troops. But why not 0, or 14,000, or 24,000? At some point the U.S. will leave, albeit presumably will still be there more or less as operations demand. So, a substantial part of the U.S. security community, spending nearly 5% of the gross domestic product of the world's largest economy, operates without an articulated future, in some real sense without a strategy. Strategy is subsumed by tactics. Or, to be more precise, the future looks like the status quo, a continuation of what we've been doing, only maybe more or less so. Getting the job done, even if the job is not specified. This is what we do. The continuation of the enterprise is also part of what it means to be professional. As suggested already, there are profound organizational and institutional constraints on what can be seriously thought or said or not. Scenarios are formed by people and institutions, and the institutions import form, telos, commitments, and a host of assumptions surprisingly independent of the world ostensibly mapped. The U.S. military provides security through the capacity to project force globally, making it difficult to ask what the purpose of U.S. engagement in Afghanistan is, and therefore making it impossible, at least under ordinary circumstances, to judge success or failure. Success or failure at what? Security, presumably. The conceptual horizon recedes. From the Pentagon's perspective, militarized global hegemony is deeply synonymous with security. Nobody in the room has the authority to say, well, why don't we devote substantial resources to thinking about doing something else? People who say things like that do not get in the room. The institutional drive towards reiteration is not just a military matter. Could Alphabet, Google, seriously entertain the idea of not digitizing things? Each university, under the banner of innovation, does exactly what every other research university does, monetizing inventions, adding administrators. To generalize, in many powerful settings, consensus is often profoundly sociologically and professionally constrained. The social horizon is far shorter than the intellectual horizon. Institutions do what they do until they are forced to do something else, or, in Darwinian fashion, they are replaced. Thus, our inquiries are leading us from the future to the past, from power to constraint. Bureaucratic rationality, the iron cage of modernity, and even politics as vocation, war horses of the sociological imagination, now seem insufficiently nuanced, at least as such terms are usually used in the academy. Towards the reimagination of bureaucracy. Much contemporary governance is actually done through decidedly undemocratic bureaucracies, what we might collectively call the administrative state. In this regard, at least, the liberal democratic order is much like the old Soviet order, whatever it is Russia has now, or China, or even a large corporation or university. Actual governance is bureaucratic. It is true that in liberal democracies, administration is legitimated by reference to liberal democracy. Representatives are elected by we the people, more or less, and those representatives delegate power to administrative agencies and bureaucracies. This, at any rate, is the story we tell in any number of regulatory law classes in the United States. What the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or the Securities and Exchange Commission, or any agency does is presumptively legitimate because it is done by bureaucratic officials hired, or their bosses were hired, by people who were elected by the people, or who were nominated and approved by the people who were elected by the people. For present purposes, the point is that liberal democracy is not the mechanism of governance. It is the mechanism of, at most, distant oversight over the bureaucracies that actually wield power, and the mechanism of legitimation for such bureaucracies. A similar dynamic plays across the European project. Whatever the Commission does is said to be democratic because of the democratic processes in the member states. It need hardly be said that such legitimacy is thin, believed by few. The late Harold Berman argued that the 20th century social revolutions, especially the Russian Revolution, experienced in the United States in attenuated form as the New Deal, gave rise to a new understanding of the state. In this understanding, the state is directly responsible for civil society writ large, health and welfare and such. This vast expansion of the role of the state required a concomitant expansion of the apparatus of the state, the growth of the modern bureaucracy. This can be seen architecturally in Washington, D.C., if one heads northwest from the White House and the rows of fine apartments built for civil servants in the 1930s and 1940s out Connecticut Avenue. One might also tell a parallel story about the rise of the giant modern corporation. The changes wrought by the English, American, and French revolutions, and a great deal of civil life and law in between, carried with them their own legitimacy. These revolutions made the set of ideas for which liberal democracy is a shorthand, a presumptively legitimate armature or model of governance. A judiciary ought to be independent, a legislature democratically elected, and so forth and so on. Such understandings have become part of the collective unconscious, at least in many societies. The 20th century social revolutions that ushered in the modern administrative state, however, were not as successful as a matter of culture and collective psychology. In particular, the social revolutions were not very successful in legitimating the administrative state. Although it came to be widely understood that the government should be responsible for education, health care, and social rights generally, the social revolution left us with little normative ordering of bureaucratic governance along the lines of the legitimating tales told for liberal democracy. Bureaucracy was and is generally seen as alienating, Kafkaesque. Weber speaks of disenchantment. Russians have endless jokes. Populists decry distant elites. Talk gets rougher. Violence may break out. Even within the capitals, bureaucracy is almost always legitimated not on its own terms, but instead by reference to liberal democracy, the achievements of the earlier revolutions. In particular, legislatures are said to delegate specific regulations and other decisions to administrative agencies. The exercise of power is legitimate because decided, in the abstract and not in detail, by the duly elected representatives of the people. The legitimacy of bureaucracy is thus derivative, even parasitic. If elections are seen to be less than genuine, as they sometimes are, and as the distance between election and bureaucracy grows, as it seemingly inevitably does, the idea that bureaucratic power is either democratic or liberal becomes harder and harder to sustain. Thus, government, elites, Europe, and so forth are easily cast as the enemy of democracy, indeed as the enemy of the people. In other words, the crisis of liberal democracy is largely a crisis for the administrative contemporary state, understood operationally in bureaucratic terms. For a long time, states, that is bureaucracies, could use stories about liberal democracy to legitimate themselves. In many societies and for many people, such stories no longer seem convincing. Instead, bureaucracies are seen to be self-perpetuating expressions of elite power. What is to be done about this situation? One answer, beloved by people that in the United States are called liberals, is to try again. That is, to make bureaucracy more directly subject to liberal democracy. Require more transparency, limit the discretion of officials, subject administrative action to legal review. There is much to be said to recommend this approach, which is basically the approach of U.S. administrative law, but it has its limits. Judicial review, transparency, and limitations all tend to produce more bureaucracy, more of the same complexities, delays, and inscrutable exercises of power that were the source of frustration in the first place. The opposite approach, ostensibly beloved by many conservatives, also as that word is popularly used in the United States, is to do away with bureaucracy whenever possible. Shrink government, drain the swamp. There are times when this makes some sense, or is at least appealing, but the limitations are equally obvious. Bureaucratic institutions, whether deemed public or private, are often required to make life possible in complex societies, indeed constitute complex societies. Rather than thinking about bureaucratic legitimacy in derivative terms, perhaps bureaucracy could be at least partially legitimated by directly addressing the central philosophical problem of liberalism itself, the absence of a shared notion of the good. Like other critics of liberalism, Alistair McIntyre argued that modern political and legal thought moves from substantive commitments to particular ideals of the good towards procedural commitments and perhaps to purely formal goods, such as equality, defined in terms of such procedures. This abandonment of notions of the good and settling on procedure, preeminently contract, in fact, is what makes the writings of Hobbes or the Peace of Westphalia modern rather than medieval achievements. If the wars of religion cannot be solved by disputation or on the battlefield, perhaps we can agree to disagree. But, as McIntyre delineates in After Virtue, such peace comes at a great price. There are things that cannot be thought or discussed without some shared notion of the goods appropriate to such things, and ultimately important to human fruition. That is, ideas of whether this or that is better for some X presumes the knowledge of what X ideally should be. A telos is an end in terms of which a thing may be understood, and a watch in terms of keeping time. The watch may also be jewelry or a paperweight, but it is timekeeper that defines the watch as a watch. This is teleology, Aristotle through Aquinas. It is classical and medieval, but by definition not modern thought. One way to understand bureaucratic delegation is that it implicitly creates spaces in which such thinking or such conversations can happen today, that is, spaces for teleological discourse within a frame of liberal democracy that explicitly denies the possibility, much less achievement, of such discourse. For example, a legislature may decide that it would be good if we had clean water or secure borders or stable financial markets or what have you, and then, in an organic statute such as the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, creates an institution devoted to such ends. In this view, bureaucracy is not illiberal merely because of its distance from liberal processes and its employment of elites. Bureaucracy is illiberal in intention and in principle. It is the way liberal societies manage to have teleological political discourse. The problem especially for diverse polities like the United States or Europe, and perhaps less obviously Russia or China, is that teleological discourse, agreement on the good, is hard to come by. People think differently about such things. So vague abstract standards suffice to authorize a regulatory agency, but must be ever half-articulated, somewhat disingenuous. Telos is associated with the stake towards which Greek foot races were run, out to the stake, around it, and back to the start line. So the idea of telos has not only purpose, run fast, but a temporality built into it. The stake is a goal, the thing to be reached, the not yet achieved, the future. So, with only a little violence, we might understand teleology in terms not of purpose secured by consensus on the nature of the good, but in terms of preferred futures. At this point, it is no more than a vague hope, but perhaps people can come to understand the bureaucracies as places where different futures are collectively thought and worked upon, places of, at least on good days, good faith and team effort, with a good will. Rather than Hobbes' Leviathan, or Weber's rationalist disenchantment and petty power politics, we might think of bureaucracy as public service towards some always yet to be finally articulated notion of the collective good. Bureaucracy, humanely conceived, could thus complement and buttress those forms of government that we, somewhat misleadingly, now call liberal democracy.